Welcome to our broadcast. Tonight, Twyla Tharp joins me to talk about a remarkable career as one of the great choreographers of the 20th century, with an instinctive curiosity about the nature of movement and a rare ability to find new ways of moving. Twyla Tharp has created her own unique style. But first, Ambassador George Kennan. He is one of America's most admired analysts of foreign policy, instrumental in the shaping of post-World War II diplomacy. He's been a scholar for a number of years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book is called Around the Cragged Hill, A Personal and Political Philosophy, and we are pleased to have him join us this evening for a conversation about the challenges for America, both domestic and foreign. Welcome. Ambassador Kennan, it's a pleasure to have you here. What struck me about, first of all, the title, Around the Cragged Hill, comes from a long, long poem by John Donne.
Why did you choose it?
Because it fitted both intellectually with my own view of things, what he said about truth sitting in a high hill, and to approach her you had to go around and about. It's right there in the...
Right. On a huge hill, cragged and steep, truth stands, and he that will reach her about must go, and what the hill's suddenness resist, winds so, yet strive so, that before age, death, twilight, the soul rest, for none can work in that night. John Donne.
I would remind you that I am 89 years old today, as
this is your birthday.
Yes.
As we tape this on Tuesday.
Explains the interest in that final clause.
Do you think about death?
Oh, no, but I was aware that I was writing a book at a very advanced age. And you see what he says.
Thy soul rests, for none can work in that night.
For none can work in that night. In other words, you do it now or you never do it.
Yes. Some wise people have said, and you've written a number of books, as I mentioned, the Pulitzer Prize. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Do you know how many?
I think about 19 or 20. This probably might be the 19th book.
This is called A Personal and a Political Philosophy. What interests me about it is that your advice to America at the end of the Cold War is to fix its own house.
That's correct.
Why do you say that? What is it that we need to do to strengthen America?
Well, first of all, I would say that for many, many years I've been persuaded that the best thing we can do for other people, the best we can do to help them, to influence them, is by example and not by what used to be called precept, not by preaching at them. That they will be much more impressed by what they see that is admirable or the other way in our own life than they will be by anything that we say to them, especially when we begin to try to talk down to them and to tell them how wonderful we are.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because if you look at what's happened in parts of Eastern Europe, the argument is made that some of the aspirations there show a finer appreciation for American values and are sometimes reflected in America, an appreciation for the democratic values.
Well, they sometimes see both virtues in our society, which we haven't seen, and they see weaknesses, too, which we haven't seen. It's like seeing yourself on the moving picture screen. You see a different person than you were aware of being.
As we talk, there's a monitor there which we can both see each other. You don't believe, and I want to come back to what we need to do in America and what we need to look at, and including some interesting and what I thought rather new ideas about restructuring the nation of the country and the nature of the republic. But you don't think we should be necessarily forcing democracy on nations around the world, that we have to understand the differences?
That is correct. In the first place, I don't think that all other nations are ready for this. Perhaps it doesn't lend itself to them at all for a democratic system. But more important than that is that, as I've just said, if we go to them and say to them, you ought to be like us, that doesn't have the effect we want to have. If we invite them to come to this country or to look at our media products, read our books, see the evidences of our civilization, and make up their own minds, that is much more effective than our saying it about ourselves.
Let me stay with that idea for 1 second. In Russia, are they ready for democracy?
Not, I'm afraid, our kind of democracy, but there has been a great change there, and the young people in the great cities, the educated youth in Russia, they certainly don't want what they've had in the past, either from the Tsarist time or from the communist time. And they do realize that they ought to have a say in things, that the government ought to be responsible, not only to what they think, but to what people think broadly across the country. And that is quite an innovation in Russian history. Some of this existed in the early years of this century, but only in a very small segment of Russian public opinion. Today, I think it is much more wider spread. I really do think that the basis is there for a democratic government, but it will not be exactly like ours.
As you know, Peter Reddaway and others are writing rather pessimistically.
Yes.
About what might happen and what might happen to Mr. Yeltsin and the divisive forces that exist there. Are you pessimistic or optimistic about that country's
up to
future?
this time, I have been more optimistic than Peter Reddaway and the others were, because it seemed to me that they judged this Russian scene almost exclusively from the relationship between the present government and the people and what the government was doing and what it was not doing. Whereas I thought that there's a great deal happening today in the Soviet Union, and thank goodness that it is so, which is not totally under government control and has some spontaneity about it. But I must say that today I think things have come to a very dangerous pass, because the inflation has gone to a point where if it is not now controlled, brought under control, if some stability is not brought into the currency picture, I just don't know what will happen. A country can't exist without a medium of exchange. And this is just disappearing down into a black hole.
And what ought to be the United States' response, and the response of Western Europe, and the response of Japan?
Well, of course, we can't do it alone. But if the present Russian government really wanted to control this inflation, and if they were to come to us and say, look, this is something we cannot do without the help of the Western world and Japan, and won't you sit down with us and see what we could do to produce a currency which would be stable, then I think we ought to respond. And perhaps we ought to suggest this to them, suggest that they do come to us and ask for our help.
Haven't they come to us and asked for our help?
Not that I know of, not in this connection. I mean, they've talked vaguely about aid from the Western world, but what we need to do is give them a stable currency, and I think I could assure you that all sorts of things, the moment that was achieved, all sorts of things would spring into life, which are now not visible. Yeah. And a good deal of money which has been exported would come back into the country. And I think all private enterprise would receive a tremendous fillip.
They would develop a confidence in the market there.
That's right.
And so therefore private enterprise would be willing to take the risk of their capital.
There is a certain analogy here to what happened with General Marshall's plan for Europe.
Marshall Plan after World War II.
That's right, in 1947. And when Marshall gave his speech, which was only a general hint that if the others were to pull themselves together, and form a common plan and come to us, we might help them. Actually, half of the problem was cured the moment people heard that speech and got the idea that something is really going to be done.
And what was cured was confidence?
Yes, confidence, the belief that really things were going to happen.
Some people will draw a distinction with the Marshall Plan and say they're not those institutions and that history of capitalistic and democratic institutions in Russia that there was in Western Europe after World War II that you could build on.
Quite true, and I'm very glad you said that, because otherwise what I said before might be misinterpreted.
Yeah.
That's true. There are great differences between the situation that existed with regard to the Marshall Plan. I merely meant to say that if they could tackle the problem, their first problem, which is that of the inflation of the currency, and tackle it successfully so that people knew that the money they invested would still be worth something 6 months hence,
yes,
then I think it might have an electrifying effect on the whole situation in Russia, comparable, although not identical, with the electrifying effect created by General Marshall.
I want you to turn now to domestic, and we'll come back to Bosnia and some other foreign policy issues, and talk about how you see the challenge to the United States as it looks internally. Clearly, the president this week addresses his own prognosis and his own diagnosis and his own plan for what to do about the economy. But your own sense of what the country needs to focus on has to do with the nature of our culture, the nature of immigration into this country, and some other issues. Sort of reflect on those that you think are serious for us in 1993.
Well, I think there are some very deep-seated problems, societal problems in the United States, which are very hard for people to perceive because they are too close to them. They are ones which many people are not accustomed to thinking about. There is the lack of an energy policy. Mm-hmm. There is, and always has been in this country, the lack of a realistic and thoughtful transportation policy. People have failed to realize to what extent society and even everybody's family life can be influenced by a transportation system. There are the great problems of education,
right,
of the ghetto, of crime, of drugs. We're all familiar with those, but we are not really mastering them. Those are the problems I have in mind. There is also, of course, the question not only of the existing budget deficit, but of the fact that we appear not to be able to live as a government without continually borrowing money. And that, I think, is a very serious problem, because that can't go on forever.
You also talk about the immigration issue.
Yes.
What do we need to do with respect to the influx of people who still come to this country with their own dreams of what they think
I'm afraid
America stands
at this
for?
stage in the development of our country, what we need to do is to stop the influx. We are well furnished with human beings in this country today. Our urban areas are too large already, too heavily populated with relation to the rest of the country. And I think we have a lot to do to digest the population that we now have. As you know, we have millions of people who are here even illegally in the country. And the first thing I think we have to do is simply to put a stop to that and to say to the rest of the world, for goodness sake, let us have an opportunity to put our own society as it now exists in order before we encumber it with more imported problems.
In 1947, you wrote for Foreign Affairs magazine under the name X, containment philosophy that subsequently brought you fame and attention and a reputation as one of the people who articulated how the United States should go about engaging in the Cold War. The world and the United States now seems to be looking for a new definition of what our role in the world ought to be. And it is dramatically different after the Cold War. We do not have a singular enemy there that we could rally. If you were rewriting, if you were today asked to define the challenge for the United States after it got its house in the order and the role it should play in the world, how would you define it?
Well, first of all, and this is in connection with what I said a few moments ago, first of all, to put our own society into such good order that it would stand as an inspiring example for other countries who want to lead the sort of life of a self-governing and democratic country, a representative government that we have. It doesn't have to be exactly like our democracy, but all who believe in humanity of government, who believe that the government should basically reflect the desires of the people, should exist only with the approval of the people. They all want to be able to look at this country and to say, look, these principles are successful. Look at the Americans.
But one of those principles that I was surprised in the book, you talk about human rights, that ought not be a part of an American foreign policy, that we should stand for human rights principles, but that we should not push our human rights objectives onto other nations?
I think that is correct. I think it was John Quincy Adams who said that America is the friend of the liberties of all the world. She is the guardian only of her own. And yes, I think that we should encourage, wherever we have the chance to do it, the observance of human rights in other countries. But I don't think we should be schoolmasterish about it, or should be out there shaking our finger or writing reports on how they're doing as though they were a bunch of school children.
Does that mean that you would favor a most favored nation treaty with the Chinese, or the People's Republic of China, even though you might be aware of significant human rights violations of people?
Yes, if the only objection to that were that they do not have an adequate human rights record, I would not regard that as a proper reason for denying them. There might be other reasons.
What then is the role of morality in American foreign policy? Because if you look at the foreign policy after World War II, there was, in a sense, a kind of crusade to containment. Communism was evil.
Ever since Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. And what now is the role of morality in American foreign policy, and how do you articulate it?
That's the hardest question you could ask me, because I have written articles, I've written about that in several of the books. In no instance have I satisfied myself that what I said was the best thing that I could have said. I can only say that, again, let us show the advantage of human rights by the aspect of our own society. We're not perfect in this respect either. There are flaws in our own behavior here. It's not that we don't have the rights.
And how we treat our own citizens in some cases.
That's right. It's not that the legal rights don't exist here. They do. But still, there are things that we should think about, which we haven't thought about, which have their relationship to human rights. I think we all know that. Our whole system of penal justice, that is what we do with people who've committed crimes in this country, is, to my mind, a little short of abominable.
Understanding that, let me make the hard choice. What is our moral obligation in a situation like we saw in Cambodia on the one hand? What is our moral obligation with respect to ethnic cleansing in Bosnia as a nation? And how do we define our responsibility beyond the sheer geopolitical definition of national interest?
I would say very little beyond it. It is only when violations of this nature, as is the case with the ethnic cleansing that's going on in the Balkans, when violations of this nature become real sources of extreme and disturbing trouble in another part of the world, which really threatens the stability of the entire region, which is the case today with the Balkan situation.
It could spread into Macedonia and Greece and Turkey.
Then I think we have a right to say, look here, you simply must not behave that way.
But the reason you are articulating is that we ought to perhaps pay close attention there is not because of what Serbs are doing to Bosnian Muslims or Croatians are doing to other people, but what we ought to do is say, if in fact this ethnic warfare has a chance to spread into Macedonia and spread into Turkey and Greece and that surrounding area, then we be alarmed.
That's right.
But not because simply people are killing other people and raping women and killing families. That cannot be.
Because the world is far too great for us to try to control the behavior of people all around the world.
We're just incapable of doing it, and if we do it one place, then
that is correct.
It will overextend us.
That is right. I think we are incapable of doing it. It's an enormous world.
But are there some places, I know these are hard questions, and I guess you have to have hard principles. There's some places where you say the obscenity and the is so awful that the world cannot stand by and allow it to happen.
Yes, that is true, that there are examples of beastliness and cruelty on so vast a scale that they become really, in the moral sense and in the international moral sense, obscene.
Yes.
And that we cannot be indifferent to them. I would say that that was true of Hitler's.
Yeah. And would it be true perhaps of Cambodia if we had...
If they went to these extremes, especially a government which is in complete control,
yes.
When it's a civil war, that's somewhat different. But when a government which is in complete control resorts to such measures, and incidentally the Stalin regime was not much better in this respect.
But there was nothing we could have done, was there? To stop
No,
Stalin?
There really isn't. There are limits.
We were incapable of exerting an influence.
There are limits to our ability to do these things. For every great effort that we make to change conditions beyond our own borders, we are taking something away from what we have to offer to our own society. And we have to measure our resources, as everyone has to. I mean, it'd be very nice if you were very rich, you could do a great many things that you like to do all around the world and in this country. But when your resources are limited, you have to count them and say, look, how many things can we set to rights?
What then should we be doing with respect to Bosnia? I mean, you've seen President Clinton take a harder stand during the campaign than he's taking now. You see, it seems to me, a growing acceptance of the Vance-Owen proposal. Are you in favor of the Vance-Owen proposal? Do you support what they are doing, or...
Oh dear, Mr. Royals, you hone in on the most difficult problems that you could ask anybody. Yes, first I would like to say that this situation that we have today in the Balkans is the most baffling and difficult situation from the standpoint of diplomacy that I have ever seen in all my life, or as a historian.
The most difficult you have
ever
seen.
And baffling. I mean, it's the most difficult to find any real answer to. Secondly, I would say that I think this is primarily a matter for the Europeans. It really is. We are expected, and I hope we will, to take an intelligent and concerned attitude toward what goes on in our own hemisphere. But the Europeans cannot stand aside from the Balkan situation and turn to us and say, please, because this is awkward for us, you know, to get into this. Right. You Americans, please solve it for us. We can help them, but we cannot replace them, in my opinion. That's the second thing I would say. Thirdly, I think that what Cy Vance and Lord Owen have been doing, they are on the right track. That is, they're moving in a direction which I think is very positive, and they're working toward a solution to Balkan difficulties, which the Balkan peoples ought to be grateful for, because it's the only ultimate solution for them. On the other hand, they're not ready for it, and I am not sure that they can be made ready for it without the application of a firm hand, in other words, without the use of force at one place or another. Where this should be, I hesitate to say, because I'm not a military person. I don't know all that the CIA and the Pentagon know, and I wouldn't want to come up with such thoughts. I can only say that there are some things which many people think we could do. Perhaps we should do some of them, but limited things. If you ask me, do you think that we could go in there, take charge of this whole situation, occupy this entire area, and govern it ourselves until we had set things to rights? The answer is no.
Of course not. And I don't think anyone is advocating that. If they are, it would seem
but that's what you're in danger of getting in if you go in.
It would suck you into that kind of position. And in fact, some of the members, some Serbs have said, in fact, that it would be just like Vietnam in terms of if, in fact, we got there and it would pull us in the same way.
Well, there is that danger. It's not only the Serbs who should say this.
Yes.
The others, too. And one of the things I think we should be careful about doing as we approach this problem, we should be careful not to play favorites too much among these countries. That the Serbs stand out as the leading culprits today is only natural. They're the strongest power. They've been able to do this.
And they've been the most aggressive.
And they've been the most aggressive. And I hope that the other ones wouldn't be that way if they were in the driver's seat. But I wouldn't, wouldn't put my bets on that.
Yeah. Let me just come back to my other question, though. Have we a clear purpose of our role today? Do you think the United States and the President have a clear understanding of what our role ought to be? Or is it still...
In this particular situation?
No, in general.
In general.
What role this country, in the post-Cold War world, the United States ought to play?
Well, I doubt it, but it's not only the new administration, but I think generally American opinion doesn't have a very clear idea. They're full of good intentions, and that came out in the Somaliland thing.
You praised that because you thought it was, you admired the discipline of the military and the Marines there.
Well, I did in the Gulf War especially, but also in Somalia, and I think our forces have really behaved magnificently in both of these situations.
Yes.
But in principle, I have never been happy about the decision to enter Somaliland.
In principle, because it was for a humanitarian reason rather than a national interest reason?
Well, it's not the only problem. There are famines going on in other parts of the world.
And if Somalia, why not Sudan?
Yes,
if
and
Somalia,
we cannot
why not Ethiopia?
straighten all of them out, and I'm not sure that we can even do it in Somalia. When we get out, I don't know. I still don't know what's going to happen there. The difficulty in
they
Somalia,
talk about substituting UN troops, as you know.
Well, I know, but this is a country without a government.
Yeah.
And whoever's going to try to set things to rights there is going to have to try to become a government of this country. That's going to be very difficult, even for the UN.
Yeah. It's clear that we are now looking at an age of multilateral diplomacy rather than
yes, and I think that's
unilateral.
right. And I think that in this post-Cold War period, I would like to see our government really, if it's got to do things in other parts of the world which are unpleasant, to do them together with the UN and as part of the UN effort.
Forgive this question, but of all the presidents you have known and studied, who do you admire the most?
My goodness, that's a very sudden question. I hate to say this because there have been things I've admired in all of these presidents and things that I have not admired. But if you go in the period after John Quincy Adams, whom I mentioned, and after Grover Cleveland, then I really suppose that Harry Truman was one of the, but I admire them for different things.
Yeah. But Truman, because he recognized...
Well, Harry Truman was a man who did have, of course, he was a politician, as most of them are, but when it could be proven to him that the fortunes of the government, that the nation were at stake, he pushed domestic politics aside and he did what he thought was right, and he did it with great courage and great firmness, and I respected him for that. I also respected FDR. He took over a tremendously difficult situation. He faced an even more difficult one with the events of World War II, and he did carry us through all this. I feel for all these people, but I think that Harry Truman would be the one I most admire. In the first place, he put General Marshall in as
yes, and he's the most admired statesman of our time.
Yes, that's right.
Of the post-war.
That's right.
Era.
And he supported him.
Yes, and we had then the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. I'm out of time, and I must tell you it's remarkable to see you and have you here. I have in front of me a quote about you in the Atlantic Monthly, I think this was, and it said, "Diplomat, scholar, writer of rare literary gifts, George Kennan is one of the most remarkable Americans of this century. A book to be published describes him as perhaps the greatest analyst and maker of foreign policy since John Quincy Adams." His new book is called Around the Cragged Hill, and I'm pleased to have you here and look forward to doing this between now and your next birthday.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.